Welcome back. Well, what was the Vatican's involvement and knowledge when it came to the sex abuse scandal, and what are the hopes for the new pontiff here in righting the church? We're going to talk about that and much more in part two of my interview with Gerald Posner, the author of God's Banker, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. One thing, Gerald, I got to admit before I read God's Bankers was I assumed for not just Nazi rank and file, but also leadership, they'd be overwhelmingly, the plurality of them, Protestant of some kind. In fact, 3/4 of them were Catholic, so we'll never know. But if the Pope came out and said it was a mortal sin to kill a Jew, who knows what would have happened? At least there could have been a difference.
Yeah, you're right. We'll never know. That's the frustrating part of it. And I think, Richard, even besides the hierarchy, the Hitlers and those that we know, 50,000 people who were involved in the actual administration of the death camps, the majority of those were Catholic, so that this was a time when the word of the Pope carried weight. In the 1940s, the 30s, they were still listening to what the Pope said. So if he had that directive, would it have stopped Catholics on the ground from participating in the killing machine? We won't know.
Fast forward a little bit here, because, as you say, the church was actually more afraid of the Bolsheviks than they were even of the Nazis. But then, how about the role of the church in the 80s with Pope John Paul II and the United States here, in many ways, working as emissaries for one another?
Yeah, one of the great alliances, one of the things the Vatican Bank ends up being used for, okay, it's used in World War II to do business with the Germans, and that's not so great. It's used after World War II to help funnel some CIA money to help defeat the communists in the first post-war election in Italy in 1948, so the conservative Italian party can win. And then it comes back into being in a political alliance and serving that function in '78 when the Polish Pope is elected, John Paul II. 2 years after his election, Margaret Thatcher becomes the Prime Minister of England. Ronald Reagan, or a few months after, actually, Thatcher comes in, and 2 years later, Reagan comes in. They form this great conservative alliance to try to topple communism back behind the Iron Curtain. And the Vatican Bank is funneling millions of dollars back to unions like Solidarity in Poland. The same priests on the ground, not the very same individuals, but that network of parishes and priests on the ground that were sending intelligence back to the Vatican in World War II about the civilian Holocaust were also now providing intelligence about what was happening inside these communist governments. It was so good that Ronald Reagan looked forward to getting those reports personally. The head of the CIA took 6 trips over to meet with the Pope. So it was this great political alliance that has not been repeated since and may not be.
To obviously the horrific abuse scandal here, and I can go to archdiocese by archdiocese and we can talk about the abuses and the aiding and abetting of these monsters, but what did you learn in putting this book together about the Vatican's role in either financing some of the cover-ups or knowledge of them that you didn't know before you started?
I thought what surprised me about the Vatican's response to the pedophilia crisis was that initially it was not about sort of shutting it down, because they viewed that as a problem for the bishops in each of the areas in America where it was first coming up, and then in Ireland and then in Australia, but more that it was a financial reaction. There was a concern that this might come back to cost the Vatican money, and because all of the dioceses in America and in other countries are built so that they're separate from each other. So if one goes bankrupt, 11 have gone bankrupt in the US, it doesn't bring down a wealthy diocese next to it. So they wanted to make sure that the Vatican itself could not be sued. And in fact, the Pope was sued. 5 different lawsuits at times claimed that he was the ultimate employer of the pedophile priest who had settlements in America or judgments against them or had gone to prison. There was real concern inside Vatican City that some American jury would eventually hold the Pope liable and a big judgment would come in. Eventually, all of those got dismissed because the church successfully argued that it's not just a religion, but it goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's a sovereign nation, and as a result, you can't sue the head of a sovereign country in an American court for that type of action, and the Vatican was safe in the end.
You know, Gerald, throughout it all, and the level of distrust, I think more acute after that than anything, we heard that the laity, folks like me in the pews, would be heard at the end. Maybe I'm looking for an optimistic end also to this, but you kind of give it with Pope Francis, where it isn't, you believe, just lip service. He's cleared out some of the folks that have been there for a long time. He's brought in outside people, including even guys from Goldman, et cetera, to try and create more transparency at the church. I know it's premature, but do we have reason for optimism that it's going to be different this time, and that I know popes come and go, but the Curia always lives. But there will be a new sheriff that will actually exert a structure that won't change with the new pontiff.
Richard, I think that's the key reason for hope is what you've just mentioned right now, that the changes being made under Francis are real changes. You know, when he came into office in 2013, he said the thing that a number of popes had said before him: I'm going to reform the finances. I'm going to get to the bottom of all of these problems. And there were hope at the beginning of other pontificates, and they turned out not to be real for a whole number of reasons. Sometimes the reforms were sabotaged by the bureaucracy inside the Curia. Other times they just weren't good reforms. This time, I think that not only is Francis serious, he's bringing in outsiders who have independent financial status who can really do the job. And in some ways, the key is they don't have a choice anymore. And what I mean by that is, ever since they've had to adopt the euro at the turn of the last century, about 14 years ago, they've had financial oversight for the first time in their 2,000 years by another entity, this time from Brussels, from the European Union. Nobody has ever had the right to look inside the Vatican Bank. Not even other divisions of the Vatican have been able to look inside the Vatican Bank. But now you have European regulators coming in from Brussels. They've done 2 inspections. They're about to do a 3rd. And they are making sure that this bank moving forward is a compliant bank. That's why in 2011, the Vatican passed its first ever money laundering law. Never had one before. In 2012, it passed its first law against the financing of terrorism and its first laws about the amount of cash you could bring into Vatican City. So it is slowly becoming a mundane, sort of run-of-the-mill, ordinary combination of a central bank and an investment bank. I think the bad old days may be over, Knock
on wood. Gerald Posner, again, the book, God's Bankers. Really a fantastic read. Thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Richard, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it as well.
And when we come back on the other side of the break, I'll have your Hudson Valley headlines. Please stay with us.